So, a warm welcome to this webinar today. I'm happy that Richard Senner will present the project or the paper Monetary Sovereignty, which is joint work with Ulrich Binzeil. Richard, we are very happy to have you in our webinar. Now the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Guido, for inviting me and for giving me the opportunity to talk about monetary sovereignty. So maybe a disclaimer, these are my personal views and also Ulrich's personal views, not related to our current or past employers. And why are we working on monetary sovereignty? Well, in the past, we both have worked on CBDC, and in the context of CBDC, more and more people talked about sovereignty, and we also worked on bank runs, financial stability issues. You've probably heard that Credit Suisse experienced a run in 2023, and the Swiss National Bank provided emergency liquidity also in dollars, which then also raises questions around international lender of last resort functions and international dimensions of sovereignty. So we had the impression that sovereignty is all over the place, but it was used in very different contexts. So we tried to kind of define it, look into the history, define monetary sovereignty. And today I will try to give you an overview of how we see monetary sovereignty, how we define it, and then illustrate one of the dimensions of monetary sovereignty, namely payments. So some recent headlines, you've probably heard about the US trade representative criticizing Brazil for unfair practices with respect to electronic payment services, referring to PIX, the payment system of Brazil. And then here in the bottom, we see the answer by Lula. He says, no, PIX is Brazil's. It's the patrimony of our people. And some commentators have argued that the US is particularly unhappy here because typical payment providers like Visa and MasterCard are losing market share in Brazil because of PIX. So then we are all aware also that the US is moving ahead with stablecoins through the Genius Act. Here in February, we have a quote from David Sachs talking about how the US wants to use stablecoins to ensure its global dollar dominance. And then another very recent quote, or relatively recent quote here with a typo from Tether in September. Tether revealed that they will issue a new stablecoin planned to be compliant with Genius. However, the Tether we know today, USDT, is not Genius compliant. Here on the right-hand side, we have the asset composition of Tether. You see things like Bitcoin and metals and gold, so assets that would not be allowed under the US Genius Act, which then might raise the question, yes, so then why don't they just take their Tether, the existing one, and make it Genius compliant? Well, because the literature finds that Tether is often used for cross-border transactions and also for transactions outside of the US. And so there's probably little incentive to make it dollar Genius compliant as of now, also raising sovereignty questions. This is basically illustrating here the cross-border flows of stable coins and unbacked crypto. And we see that the two largest stable coins here in orange, they are always already at levels comparable to unbacked crypto. So while the size overall today of stable coins is not very large, they appear to be heavily used in cross-border payments. So then there are many other dimensions of sovereignty you could think about and that people have discussed. Here's an example from the dimension of monetary policy from 2022. Maybe some of you remember this was the time where inflation was still relatively high. Central banks all over the world were fighting inflation. And here Andrew Bailey told the BBC that wage rises needed to be moderate, with firms showing restraint in pay talks, being afraid of some kind of wage price spiral. However, the union said, no, look, inflation is mostly driven by energy prices. Or other commentators argue that there's also the profit dimension, so the markups that firms charge for their prices, and this should also be considered. And it's unfair that the Bank of England only warns about wages. And here's another example for a domestic struggle over sovereignty, if you want, from history. So I would say that our work overall is, to a large extent, is inspired by historical episodes. Here from a professor in Geneva. She has looked at the Bank of Spain. And in 1874, the government grants the Bank of Spain the national monopoly on banknote issuance. Very similar things have happened with the Bank of England and other central banks around the world. Here, just Bank of Spain for fun. And she says social groups that had economically benefited from monetary fragmentation were opposed to the creation of this national currency. So what does this mean? You had regional banks. They were issuing their own banknotes. They were making money, seigniorage, and then with this new monopoly, they lost power and profits. And some banks in the north of Spain, then they still continued to issue their own banknotes. They were linked to the industrial and part and could kind of resist. But this is to illustrate that the struggles over monetary sovereignty were also at the origin of central banking. So coming to the first part of my presentation, monetary sovereignty, what is it? How can we define it? Well, we have one paper where we look in detail into the concepts of national sovereignty, economic sovereignty over the course of history. Economic sovereignty is typically related to things like absolute advantages, comparative advantages, trade, free trade, tariffs, migration, international agreements, etc., etc. But we are particularly interested in monetary sovereignty, which we define as follows, and this is going to be a little bit of a longer definition. Namely, we say it's the freedom and ability of a state's people to effectively govern themselves as a community, such as to decide and implement the best policies to control the creation and circulation of monetary instruments in the present and future interest of the people. Okay, so why is this so long? For a variety of reasons. First, it's an ability, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you are using this ability to exercise control. Okay, so some scholars have argued, why are you talking about sovereignty? It's an outdated concept. No one cares about sovereignty anymore. It doesn't matter. And if you equate sovereignty with a state that uses its power to suppress everything that is not the state, then you could argue this is true. However, we define sovereignty as this ability. So it does not mean that you're maximizing your control. It just means that in principle you have the capacity to, for example, control cross-border flows, but you might decide to not do it for other purposes because you want to benefit from global capital flows, global economies of scale. Then another note here below. Initially, we had a shorter definition, just talking about implement the best monetary policies. Okay, and why was this, or why did this turn out to be problematic? If we talk about monetary policies in today's economic world, typically then people refer to the interest rate setting of central banks. They might also think about unconventional monetary policy tools like quantitative easing, quantitative tightening, special lending facilities, etc. But we don't want to be constrained in our definition just to monetary policies, interest rate setting. So we want to be broader. And we'll see in a bit how broad we want to have the scope here. Another.
So, may I ask a
yeah,
question?
Sure.
Just so Switzerland has monetary sovereignty, more or less, one can say, according to this definition. And what about Germany?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, so here we have really the creation and circulation of monetary instruments, and that's very wide. In a second, we will see that this ranges from the central bank, from money issuance, it goes to banking, to shadow banking, to financial market infrastructures, to your foreign exchange regime, to how you are embedded within the global financial architecture, and then all the way up to infrastructure topics like cybersecurity, data protection, etc. So in principle, sovereignty is very wide. And you could say along some of these dimensions, yeah, Switzerland is definitely sovereign. It's issuing its own currency, etc. And what about Germany then? You could say Germany does no longer issue their own currency. But if you think about sovereignty as this capacity in principle, then it's not that a foreign power issued euro instruments and spread them within Germany against the will of its people or so. It was kind of a voluntary decision to kind of give up on the national um, currency issuance because the state perceived other benefits from joining this monetary union to be larger overall. So although Germany is part of a monetary union right now, you could, if you would rank countries in according to their monetary
Yeah.
sovereignty, and if you
Uh-huh.
would look at the dimension of issuing your own currency, you could, according to our definition, still give Germany a relatively high score because they voluntarily gave up on it, and you could say they would have the capacity to. Tomorrow, the Bundesbank, etc., they have the technical capacities to, in principle, go back and issue their own currency again if they decided to do so. However, many other countries in the world, they don't have the capacity to issue their own currency, and they might be dollarized not because they want to, but because they are um, don't have the instruments to the capacity to fight it, if this makes sense. And then another important part of this definition here is the people, because if you look into the history of thought on sovereignty, then it was often just about the state. And some scholars would say, okay, you have a state, you have a king, you have a queen, and they are powerful, they issue their own currency, they control the whole financial system, and therefore this country is highly monetary sovereign. However, you can say kind of take a modern modern definition where we focus on the citizens of the state. So we take this left perspective here, which is also in the literature known under popular sovereignty. So the people or the citizens are the subject, and this right-hand side definition kind of is often used in the past. But here, if you follow this right-hand side, you could say, okay, a government that is able to make the banking system incredibly rich or crush the banking system for the benefit of one big state bank is very sovereign because they have the capacity to do all these things, but they might not have the capacity to do things for the benefit of citizens. And we think for today, what is really to have a meaningful definition, to have a meaningful concept, in the end, you have to kind of link this to the citizens, or you could maybe also call it welfare. Now, what is monetary sovereignty not? So I already mentioned it's not kind of exercising control in a narrow sense. If you would, for example, close your banking system, then you would lose a lot of benefits related to innovation, competition, trade, etc., that countries typically don't want to give up. Also, when we talk about international monetary sovereignty in a narrow sense, you could either search autonomy just for the sake of it, but this then, according to our definition, has nothing to do with monetary sovereignty. You might kind of shut your country um, and also then lose benefits from global economies of scales and networks. Or you could pursue it in a too narrow aggressive sense, seeking dominance of others. Here on the right-hand side is a quote from an economist, Sila, talking about the former sub-Saharan countries. And he says France had conceded independence only on condition that newly independent countries would have to keep the CFA franc. So in other words, and he's criticizing this, he says this is not real independence if you do not have your own currency, and this is kind of a monetary dominant strategy of France that he's criticizing. Now, so why do we care about monetary sovereignty? Maybe just in a nutshell, the literature argues that there are different benefits to it. Monetary and macro financial stability is a key dimension. We've briefly mentioned the lender of last resort function in the introduction, for example. So if you have a central bank that is able to act as lender of last resort in your country, you can increase financial stability. But there are also many microeconomic objectives related to consumer protection, fraud, prevention, competitiveness, network effects. Think about all the kind of antitrust regulations. And then you also have income generation related to seigniorage if you issue your own currency. But you can also think about the taxable industry income. Think, for example, about a domestic payment system that is dominated by foreign players, and all the profits are kind of sucked out of your country and they are taxed somewhere else. And then we have wider benefits related to some kind of resilience towards foreign aggressors, and also information advantages and data protection issues. So now, Guido, related to your question you had before, is Switzerland sovereign? Is Germany sovereign? I think this was one of the key motivations to do this research, because sometimes people would say, okay, there's a country, this country issues its own currency and therefore it's sovereign. And then Germany is not monetary sovereign or so. And we said, no, this is kind of too narrow. We have to take a broader scope, and we broadly come up with these three different sets of dimensions that we think are important to monetary sovereignty. So here first, we talk about money issuance and its function. And historically, many scholars have said you have your own currency, then you're monetary sovereign. However, what if you have your own currency, but everybody in your country is doing the accounting in a foreign currency, in dollars, in shilling, whatsoever? How monetary sovereign are you then? What if you issue your own currency, but the means of payment is very different? Or the payment system is dominated by foreign powers that you cannot really control. And then you can go, if you think about a money hierarchy, with central bank money at the top, and then bank money, and then near money things like money market funds or so. All these dimensions matter as well. Think, for example, about the banking system. You might have your own currency. You might have a banking system that creates your own currency, but your banking system could still be dominated by particular interests from a domestic perspective, or internationally. It could be dominated by foreign shareholders. And if they want to put your system at risk, they could easily do it. So we say all of these dimensions matter. And then also monetary policy and international monetary regimes matter. What kind of currency convertibility do you have? If we go back in time, of course, gold convertibility was key. A priori, gold convertibility limits your sovereignty because you tie yourself to some kind of physical good, but you could still decide to voluntarily do it. We have all the international dimensions related to, for example, the IMF, the Fed, international swap lines. And then we have a whole box of monetary infrastructure dimensions related, ranging from central custodians, cybersecurity issues, and illicit payments. And the idea here is really that if you wanted to talk about monetary sovereignty for one country, you would really have to look at all these dimensions. So for us, it's not a binary concept. Some scholars have also argued it's binary, like either you're monetary sovereign or you're not. We really say there are many shades of gray along all of these dimensions. And if you're a country and you're worried about your monetary sovereignty or so, you should really look across all of these dimensions. Because what we see often is that some country might be very worried about, I don't know, maybe a foreign payment provider within their current country. But then you look at other dimensions like a derivatives market, the shadow banking system, or cyber issues, and there you see it's completely off. It's a kind of a magnitude higher or lower the kind of capacity that you have to control these issues. So here's one way to then think about how sovereign you are across all these different dimensions. Here we very generally, you could say the shade of monetary sovereignty is defined by the public versus private dimension, the domestic versus foreign, and the state's own capacity. Meaning that even if you have low private and low foreign pressures to your monetary dimensions, this does not automatically indicate high monetary sovereignty if the state is weak per se. If the state has no capacity at all to maybe issue an own currency, to run a digital payment system, then even if no one else is stopping you to do it, you might still not have the capacity, and then your monetary sovereignty is low. And here in this table, to illustrate it, say, for example, you have something like in Switzerland now, the payment system is gaining market share. So it's a domestic private market share. And if you are in the sovereign, you might over time kind of monitor Twint. And there was recently a law along with certain regulations. And you can say as a state, okay, it's a domestic company. We have domestic laws. We want to, we are happy to have an efficient system, etc. We have kind of rules and regulations to keep this in check. However, the situation might be slightly different if you obey to all your laws. And monetary sovereignty has this capacity, right? And we say it's not a black and white concept. It comes along all of these dimensions. And then you could say, okay, let's look at all of these dimensions and let's see if we're sovereign or not. Reasons, etc. And you could say that initially they were really doing what you thought they would do, supporting the real economy, being sound and safe, etc. But over time, they could reallocate credit to speculative activity in a kind of Minskian instability perspective, contradicting the original purpose that you had in mind as a sovereign. So just because you set the banking system up in a way that you like it today doesn't mean that in 10 years from now, you'll still be happy with it. And then second, we have these asymmetric pulls that inherently, because of the power of the creditor, or some call it the asymmetric settlement constraint. If you have money, if you have a claim on someone, typically no one typically forces you to spend it, right? So I can have a 1 billion deposit account with a large global bank, and I don't have to spend it. However, I can withdraw within a second, creating financial stability risks. But on the other side of the balance sheet, those people who owe money to the bank, they typically have a due date at which they have to pay money back. So this is an inherent asymmetry that has kept monetary sovereignty busy for hundreds of years on how to kind of ensure some kind of circulation of monetary instruments, if you want. And then second, we have the power of economy, also part of why I think sovereignty is coming up right now, because it's accelerated by digitalization. And then third, we say there's this endogenous dynamism and uncertainty of monetary systems linked to, if you want to go back to Keynes in his fundamental uncertainty or so, it means that stability of money is not guaranteed, right? So if you issue money today, it's typically against some kind of future claim. You lend someone money, and a nation must then constantly adapt if it wants to preserve its capacity. So one way would be to think about a bank run or other risks that change the system over time. So here's an example of, if this was to abstract this table, an example of how to, for example, think about the second dimension, that there's an inherent pull towards asymmetry. Okay, if you observe some force behind such hierarchies, but you can also react to them and counterbalance them. And the history is full of examples for both cases. On the left-hand side, the first bullet here illustrates most prominent example for how the sovereign came in and created centralization on purpose through the creation of central banks with a note issuance monopoly. Here, typically, the Swiss National Bank was also founded in 1905. because merchants complained about inefficient payment system, and with many other central banks it was similar. You had different coins and notes circulating, and if you are an agent in this economy, you never know which coin is good, which banknote is good. There were of course other reasons as well to create central banks, but this was one of the central reasons. And then you say, okay, from now on we have this one central bank, and they issue banknotes, making the system overall more efficient and creating centralized counterparties, securities, depositories, or interbank payment systems are similarly sovereign interactions to centralize the system. Right? In the past, if every bank does bilateral payments, etc., today we typically have real-time gross settlement systems through the central bank. But then there are also examples where the sovereign says, okay, no, I want to lower concentration. Think about China or BRICS countries saying that we want to have a less US dollar centric system. We want to create our own BRICS-based payment system. Or you want to avoid concentration through having a good lender of last resort. Okay, this is maybe not very intuitive at first sight, but before we have said we have this asymmetry between the debtor and the creditor. And what happened in the past, in the Great Depression or so, you have a deflationary spiral. What does it mean? Debtors are really struggling to repay their debt, and they are fire selling their assets, and the asset prices are collapsing. And if you don't have a lender of last resort, the prices go down, 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 down. And the share of the population that still has financial instruments to buy assets can buy them very cheaply. And after such a crisis, you end up with much more inequality, with a much more unequal, asymmetric distribution of financial instruments. And here you could say having a lender of last resort that steps in such a moment balances the system. Or you could also think about a regulator saying my banking system is not really competitive when it comes to payment systems, right? They're some kind of oligopolistic for whatever reason. So now we impose open banking on them. So we force them to open some layer of their infrastructure for third parties to come in and make it cheaper. So overall, this was just an example. We argue that there are different instruments available to strengthen monetary sovereignty. First, there are the basic choices regarding your monetary and financial architecture, like do you want to have gold convertibility? Do you want to have gold and silver convertibility? Do you want to promise dollar convertibility or have your own currency? Do you want to have a central bank? How do you design your central bank, etc.? And then the second broad category tells you what kind of financial instruments do you maybe want to issue your own, or what kind of infrastructures do you want to operate your own? Like banknotes is the most prominent example of a financial instrument that is really issued by the state. But then again, when it comes, for example, already to printing the banknotes, it's again often private companies. And then third, we have the regulation, supervision, and enforcement towards the private sector as another important instrument. Now, this is not to say that these instruments are always readily available. As we said before, the state capacities, the state-owned capacity matters, and a state might say, yeah, we would like to have our own domestic payment system, but we don't have any IT people around to write the code for it. And then you might not be really able to use this instrument. As of now, you would first have to build some capacity. And so then what we finally do is to look a little bit kind of ahead. We've said monetary sovereignty is this capacity, right? It's an interesting thing because it comes with all these different dimensions. And then we have said it's dynamic, so it's changing over time. And we've said there's certain instruments you can use to strengthen it if you wanted to. And now the final part is to look at the current state of the world and what are probably the key challenges to monetary sovereignty. And here I summarize 3 of them that we think are a key challenge to monetary sovereignty. First, it's the digital transformation of money, in particular the disappearance of cash, right? People use less and less cash. And the question is, how do you react to it? How do you react to it? And then you have new unregulated entities, for example, stable coins that act as bearer money. So whoever holds the stable coin owns it. You cannot trace it to the identity, so you have limited anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist regulation. And we also see a rise of concentration and monopolistic rent seeking due to the digital transformation. So the economies of scale are very strong here. Then second, more generally, we see some kind of changing world order, some kind of multi-polar system where different jurisdictions challenge the dollar-centric system. And you could some also argue that we see a rise in nationalism and the weaponization of finance. So you use your power over a custodian, you use the power, the regulatory power that you have over a payment system to exclude certain participants for political reason. And then third, we see more general challenges to the traditional governance models, in particular monetary policy as such, or the independence of central banks and their mandates is discussed heavily due to a variety of factors, including, for example, climate change. The ECB is a prominent example where many economists have argued that it's really up to the central bank to also help somehow with the green transitions, and others say no, the mandate is really different and we don't have the instruments to do it. And then if we look at the kind of distribution of financial instruments, that then we can point to high public debt levels, but also high private debt levels in certain areas that risk so-called fiscal or private dominance, where then certain large debtors influence the overall system for their individual benefit, potentially at the expense of other citizens. So this was the first part, with the idea to kind of define it, to say what are the dimensions, why should we care about, why is it interesting, why do we think it's useful, and now we could in principle spend days going through all of these different dimensions and they are all very interesting, I think, and in all of these dimensions there's so much going on. Now I just want to give some examples from the payment area. And as I already mentioned, if we go back in history, then the issuance of central bank money was really often a key to overcome inconveniences and costs associated with species and privately issued IOUs. Okay, right? This means, so in the past you had different banks or other entities, they would issue their own debt instruments. And if you are a merchant, you might know, okay, this kind of this family, the Pictet Bank in 1900, really very safe. We can accept their notes, no problem. But then suddenly someone comes and wants to pay with a different banknote. You have never seen this banknote, etc. So it's it does not appear very efficient. The Bank of Amsterdam is another example where in 1609 it was created because merchants complained about the chaotic payment system. Right. So we have also Hayek. Hayek is famous in this context because he argued for some kind of competition between different forms of money, but also he agreed that in the end, potentially only one or two will survive, because it doesn't make sense that you as an ordinary citizen have a portfolio of 5-6 different currencies in your pocket and are then basically a foreign exchange trader. And I already mentioned that the S&P was also founded due to perceived market failures in the payment system. Now, we can, for example, look at public money versus commercial bank money-based payment instruments and look at this table here. We can look at payment instruments that are based on commercial bank money and on central bank money. If we look at commercial bank money, we can come back to PIX that we mentioned in the introduction. PIX is a payment system in Brazil. It's operated by the central bank. And if you have traveled to Brazil, it works incredibly well. You can already do your tax stuff through PIX automatically. So it's completely operated by a public entity, and therefore you naturally have very strong public control. Then you can think about the Indian UPA. It's kind of a universal payment interface, which means that the last layer is kind of open then to private participants, but the things below are still very much controlled by the public sector. Then maybe further right, we can think about EPI, foreign there's this nice quote about EPI, the Private European Payments Initiative, EPI, and they themselves talk about in favor of European sovereignty in payments. Okay, why do they do this? In their argument, they look to the right-hand side. So they look to PayPal, international card schemes, and they say, this is not good for European sovereignty. That's why we need the private European payments initiative, also for the sake of sovereignty. So they use sovereignty as an argument in favor of their initiative. However, then of course, if you look at the whole spectrum, there are other designs that would come along with even higher levels of public control. And you could come up with a similar classification for CBDC. On the left-hand side, we can think about a silo CBDC that has maybe comes a little bit closer to maybe what the Chinese are doing. So it could be a CBDC that is really operated from A to Z by the central bank. So the central bank would maybe even issue or produce digital gadgets that you can use to pay with a CBDC, etc. Then you have something like the digital euro here in the middle. It's industry integrated with a decentralized distribution. So yes, you grant access to the central bank balance sheet, but how this access is managed, etc., is then partially left to the private sector. Or you could also come up with a raw material CBDC, right? So when you say CBDC, many people think about this very strong public control thing typically. But you can just say we are the central bank. Our account is open to anyone who wants it. Kind of Wild West in principle, which would then come with a very weak public control, and no central bank is currently considering such a raw material CBDC where everybody can just do what he or she wants. We can also then look at stablecoins as payments instruments. So you can look at stablecoins from different perspectives. You can look at them from the perspective of generating demand for your government bonds, et cetera, et cetera. But now if we look at payment instruments, we can also kind of rank them. And you could come up with an account-based public coin or a sovereign stable coin. There are different names circulating for some kind of stable coin that would, for example, be 100% backed with central bank money, where you then would have very strong control. Then we have regulatory regimes like MiCA and Genius. Genius, for example, tells you to have certain, you have to publish your reserve assets, you have to comply with certain supervision, etc., etc. Then we have the Virgin Islands regime that is used by Tether, where in principle, if you read it, you also have even some anti-money laundering dimensions, but then people argue it's not really enforced. Or you could have a very weak stablecoin regime with an anonymous issuer that no one even knows, that is not even registered on the Virgin Islands. In theory, that does not exist today. So and then you can say, okay, stablecoins per se, they are not a threat, but they use some kind of new technology. But you want to, for example, create a level playing field with commercial bank money. They can facilitate dollarization, and you also have other international dimensions, for example, related to multi-jurisdictional issuance. So you can have a stablecoin that is technically identical throughout two jurisdictions, but has different reserves in the two jurisdictions. And then if you think about a bank run scenario, people will, of course, run in the jurisdiction with the better reserves. And so you can then kind of look into the history of cash or free banking to maybe draw some ideas on how to create optimal stablecoin regimes. And maybe before I conclude, one example from Switzerland, also kind of illustrating this dynamism. We have the Swiss law on payment firms, which says a payment system is an entity that clears and settles payment obligations based on uniform rules and procedures, supervised by FINMA, and the SNB can specify special requirements for systemically important payment systems, which today consists of SIC, the Interbank Clearing System, operated by SIX AG on behalf of the SNB. So here we see there are a variety of constructs on how you can kind of set up your monetary architecture. Then this is kind of the status quo. In the payment behavior, if we look at this figure, we see that the decline in cash is high. We see important international card schemes and the rise of new digital payment solutions like Twind. We have here the international card organizations, so Visa, MasterCard in red, they are very prominent still. Domestic payment solutions, they would include Twind. So Twind is a new Swiss payment app using SIG for end-day netting. And in February 2025, the federal court has ruled that Twind is a payment system, because Twind has said, no, we are not a payment system. We are just an app. We are just kind of a nice, convenient interface for users. But then the court said, no, you are actually a payment system that then comes along with certain regulation. Also, the Swiss interbank clearing system is advancing forward towards instant payment systems, right? You might have seen this recently with your banking app, that if you sometimes have to pay a little bit, then you can also do instant payment systems with your existing Swiss franc account. And Visa, MasterCard, for example, they are not classified as payment firms, right? They are kind of card schemes, so they do not fall under this law. But the question is, yeah, when was this law drawn? And this also always kind of has to be seen in a historical context. And if Visa and MasterCard were around in such a dominant way, maybe then back then the law would have looked somewhat differently. But then in this case, we currently have the Swiss Competition Commission that looks into the fees that are charged by these actors, right? So you could, yeah. So this is just to illustrate that there are new players around, structures change over time, and it really calls for constant horizon scanning and dynamic adaptation of frameworks to remain sovereign. So let's conclude. Let me try to summarize. We say monetary sovereignty is a useful and topical concept. The way we define it as this capacity for the benefit of citizens, for public goods, etc., it's then not outdated. It doesn't necessarily mean to exercise control. Yeah, just because you're sovereign doesn't mean you use all your capacity to crush everything that is not owned by the state. It's not black and white. It's not a binary concept. There are scholars who say it's binary and we say it's not, in particular because you have so many different dimensions, right? You can't just talk about having your own currency. You have to look at the whole money architecture, the whole money hierarchy, all the instruments. And then we've said it's interesting because it's dynamic, it's changing over time. And the challenging thing for policymakers or for participants is that sometimes for decades, certain dimensions appear super stable. Yeah, Charles Goodhart recently said in a call, monetary policy was pretty easy since the 80s because this interest rate moving thing really somehow pretty good moved with the inflation, but over hundreds of years and maybe even again now, if some boundary conditions change, like fiscal, trade, wage policies, etc., then relationships break down that you once thought were stable, to quote Charles Goodhart here. And then finally, we see that currently ICT developments, geopolitical shifts, and domestic pressures all challenge monetary sovereignty, not at least due to the decline in cash and the rise of stablecoins if we focus on this payments dimension. So this would be it. Here are also the links to the papers if you want to read more. Thanks a lot.